My name is Noel Ward. I am chairing this next session, and just to begin by thanking our sponsors, that this event is supported by the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media as part of the Decade of Centenaries programme, and by Dublin City Council. So this, our presenter this morning, Brian Hanley, does not really need any introduction to people who are interested in labour history or in history in general. He is a prolific author of many fine studies of various aspects of history, including labour history. And his title, I think, is one that is one of the perennial debates in Irish history generally. The socialism, nationalism, labour must wait kind of debate about the wisdom and the prevalence of that, you know, in Irish labour history and in Irish history generally. So please welcome Brian Hanley.
Thank you very much, Noel. Good morning. Firstly, I'll warn you that I've been up since 2:30, so please bear with me if I start to forget. I left these notes outside and forgot where they were just 5 minutes ago. So my sincere thanks to the Irish Labour History Society for the invitation to speak here this morning, especially to Jack McGinley for facilitating my late request to change speaking slot and day. I also want to really sincerely thank Francie Devine and Sonja Tiernan for their understanding and support when I had to withdraw from the unfortunately contributing to the fantastic collection which they've edited along with John Cunningham, and it's really a credit to them and the Society and to Umiskin Press. And as well as congratulations on 50 years, I want to stress again the importance of SARE as a journal, not only for its role in forcing labour history into the mainstream of Irish historiography, but also as a vital platform for scholars, particularly young scholars, writing on a diverse range of topics. And again, if you look at SARE's contribution, it is far from only a labour history journal. There's really a phenomenal amount of insights and discussions that have been part of that journal over the last 50 years. And it really is, I think, essential for anyone who wants to look at Irish history. Anyway, to start, in January 1922, Winifred Carney cautioned readers of The Voice of Labour for his assumptions about where James Connolly and Pádraig Pearse would have stood on the question of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The world, she asserted, has a peculiar habit of moving on. And she was, of course, correct. Attitudes, opinions, and political views are not frozen in time. They change according to context and opportunity. So the concept of a workers' republic was unacceptable to broad sections of Irish society, particularly to the Catholic Church, when the Labour Party flirted with it in 1936. But it hadn't been unacceptable in 1922, when Labour criticised the treaty for not delivering this type of republic. Then, in 1922, the language of revolutionary socialism, of Soviets, of general strikes and workers' power were common currency in Ireland, not just among the mainstream Labour movement, but among the Republican movement as well. Dáil Éireann had sought political recognition from the USSR and had in fact supplied funds to the Bolsheviks. 3 years later, some of the same Republicans, now in government, would warn of the danger of Bolshevism and use it to justify harsh measures against, among others, striking workers. Association with revolutionary socialism, particularly anything that could be labelled communism, would become a political kiss of death in Ireland, not only among broader society, but also in the labour movement itself, as many of the splits and disputes chronicled in SARE over the years will illustrate, most tragically and dramatically probably in the 1940s. Indeed, as late as June 1969, Red Scare tactics would be used again against the Labour Party moving moderately leftwards. Then Neil Blaney, among others, would warn of the pseudo-intellectual Marxists, Maoists, Trotskyists and the like, who have emerged like carrion birds to pick on the flesh of the Irish people. That general election was replete with tales of Russian submarines being invited to refuel off the west coast and of Irish embassies being relocated from Lisbon to Havana. One of the Fianna Fáil ministers who embraced this rhetoric was Kevin Boland, whose uncle Harry had been a key figure in contacts with the Bolsheviks in New York 50 years before. So Winifred Carney was correct that things do have a peculiar habit of moving on. Though unfortunately looking around us today, there are echoes of many of the same issues that Irish revolutionaries faced a century ago. The Irish Revolution took place in a world when the right of nations to self-determination had become a central issue, and when the so-called right of great powers to intervene where they saw fit was being challenged, where oppressed peoples had forced their demands onto the global stage, when women had found a new confidence, and when millions not only looked with hope to the idea of a new fairer society, but also when others, equally as numerous, traumatized by war, terrified by the changes it had brought, and following a global pandemic, took solace in conspiracy theories or clung bitterly to old certainties, while counter-revolution in the shape of fascism emerged. And I think it is, significant that some of these issues remain pertinent to us, unfortunately. Now, in September 1919, an Irish Republican addressed a trade union audience in New York and told them that though he was not a Labour leader per se, he was entitled to speak for all sections of the nation and for Labour in particular, insomuch as with the exception of a certain of the workers of Belfast, whose affiliations were British, organised Labour in Ireland subordinated themselves at the recent elections, that is in 1918, its own interests to the interests of the nation, and enthusiastically supported the Republican candidates, who were therefore Labour's sole parliamentary representatives. He then told them that Irish Labour wished to end class dictatorship, and it recognised that the economic emancipation which it had in view would almost be certain of achievement under a democratic Irish Republic. Every effort of theirs to win their rights is sure to be opposed, on the other hand, by the military forces of the British Crown that are always at the disposal of the exploiting capitalist. He continued, in the Labour world, the Irish patriot James Connolly, whom many of you knew personally, he said, was known as a socialist. There was nothing inconsistent with his economic idea in his life and death as an Irish Republican. His position is very much our position. Connolly's story is broadly the story of Irish Labour throughout history. The leisured classes were sometimes seduced from their national allegiance by a seat at the conqueror's table, but Irish Labour stood ever true to its convictions. It suffered most and was most faithful. When Irish patriots despaired of winning to their side the side of sacrifice, the people of property, they could always count on that very respectable class, the people of no property, who had no sacrifice to make but the supreme sacrifice of their lives. In them, Tone and Mitchell, Davis and Maher placed all their hopes. Not surprisingly, this speech featured prominently in the Watchword of Labour a few weeks later. And it's one of several similar speeches in that era from Eamon de Valera. The language will be familiar to anyone who's read socialist Republican interpretations of the period, but it precedes Liam Mellow's Notes from Mountjoy by several years, though I think Mellow's may have had a hand in drafting aspects of the speech. In August 1921, de Valera told the Irish Labour and Trade Union Congress that were it not for the solidarity of Labour behind the national cause, the Irish cause would not be where it is today. And he thanked them again for putting their sectional interests aside in 1918. So I think when we talk about Labour and socialism and so on, the national question 100 years ago, it is not the case of Labour being told to wait. As the late Rainer Lyset explained in Sayre back in 2001, this in many ways was a myth. But Labour, for a variety of reasons, was content to play second fiddle, until a truce period at least, at which point what had been essentially the benign neutrality of the Republican movement towards organised Labour began to change. But alignment with Irish republicanism made sense for the majority of the Irish Labour movement because they broadly shared the same views. Affected Irish Labour too. The story of the Irish Labour movement and its relationship to nationalism was different for that section of Labour referenced by de Valera, who lived and worked in Ireland's industrial heartland in northeast Ulster. There, the unionist elite was acutely aware of the danger posed by socialism. As Edward Carson put it in his famous 12th of July speech in 1920, the men who come forward as the friends of Labour care no more about Labour than the man in the moon. 50 years on, the same phrase was used by the Ulster Volunteer Force when it told the official Republicans, then seeking to promote working class unity, that you are no more interested in working class Protestants than the man in the moon. Now, the result of Carson's speech in 1920 was the workplace expulsions, whose victims were mainly Catholic, but who, of course, included substantial number of Protestant trade unionists and socialists, the so-called rotten prods, one of whose stories, Dungaree Bard, has been brought to life by Emmett O'Connor last year. Of course, Carson's speech was designed to destroy any prospect of working class unity, but it points again, of course, to a serious division within the Irish working class around the issue of the national question between unionism and nationalism. But for most of Irish labour, the revolutionary era was a period of intense expansion, confidence and growth. And I'm not sure really if we were able to convey this adequately during the decade of centenaries. The lockdown certainly didn't help, coinciding as it did with what might have been opportunities to discuss the general strikes of 1920s, the munitions boycott and so on, although again, Peter Rigney produced a really good booklet on the munitions dispute. We almost always come back to 1913 as the year zero, and everything else often seems like an add-on. Yet, as people will be aware, Labour in 1920 was a powerful, genuinely national force. Organising, it needs to be stressed again, thousands of that almost forgotten sector of Irish society, the farm labourer. There's a whole industry dedicated to the memory of the Irish big house, and far too little attention paid to the men and women of the little houses. But an indication of the mood at the time was expressed by a complaint in the Royal Irish Constabulary Gazette in 1920, when it lamented that once the police officer had been a vastly superior man to the railway porter and the agricultural labourer, and yet behold how they have advanced. Another measure of the times was that a local Irish transport union organiser in Bagnallstown, County Carlow, could state matter-of-factly in 1920 that we've held a public meeting on the Market Square and publicly proclaimed the establishment of a provisional Soviet government. Suggests something, of course, of the mood abroad and also of the influence of revolutionary socialism on mainstream labour. But there were, of course, contradictions, which the separatist intellectual Ave de Blackham noted in his What Sinn Féin Stands For, published in 1921. And de Blackham, as an analyser of Republican politics, has been, I think, underappreciated. A man called Sean Donnelly has been writing about him recently, but I think it repays looking at what he was saying, because he's much more, in many ways, indicative of Republican thought than some of the radicals, perhaps. But what de Blackham says was that Catholic communities are generally hostile to socialism. So the socialist enthusiasm which ran over Ireland during 1919 surprised and puzzled many. But there the fact was, never was Ireland more devoutly Catholic, and yet nowhere was the Bolshevik Revolution more sympathetically saluted. Labour organisation, directed by avowed out-and-out socialists, went ahead by leaps and bounds. In 1920, it held the balance of power over extensive areas. Most remarkable of all, it expanded into rural areas. And today, Labour and the peasant proprietor, were they to combine, could dominate Irish politics. Now, that did not happen, of course, and there was no Workers' Republic. And again, there's no shortage of people who will explain that through lack of leadership or lack of a revolutionary vanguard or the impact of what they see as a counter-revolution. Important to stress, however, I think, that there was also almost nobody challenging the Catholicness of the mass of the people. And at the same time that Sinn Féin were talking to the Bolsheviks, they were talking to the Vatican and assuring them that Irish revolutionaries were not like these other atheist revolutionaries in other parts of the world. And certainly the influence of religion can't be dismissed in terms of what ultimately develops in the country. But I also think to understand what occurs, we have to go beyond organised labour and look at class as well, because these terms are not, of course, interchangeable. When the Republican Todd Andrews recalled the revolution, he described his comrades as the children of unimportant people, the men of no property, of whom Wolfe Tone spoke. He also asserted that the ethos of the Republican movement before the treaty had been egalitarian. We assumed that apart from the usual tendency of tuppence halfpenny to look down on tuppence, the Irish nation in the mass was a classless society. There was no social immobility based on birth or inherited wealth. And this is quite a widespread assumption among separatists and Republicans. It explains perhaps why Fianna Fáil's Brian Lenihan could describe Southern Ireland in 1972 as classless, and why Charles Haughey would claim that class warfare, envy and strife were inherently un-Irish. Yet of course Ireland 100 years ago, as today, was a society acutely aware of class division. Andrew's colleague Ernie O'Malley used similar phrases to him, but with quite different meanings when he said, "In the towns tuppence halfpenny looked down on tuppence, and throughout the country the grades in social difference were as numerous as the layers of an onion." Indeed, Jim Larkin's Irish Worker had recognised this prior to the lockout, when it lamented how the existence of class distinction among the women workers of Dublin is deplorable. Each different section of workers keeps entirely to themselves. You find the girl who earns her living as a typist stands icily aloof from the girl who works in the shop and the tradesgirl. They in their turn look down haughtily on the factory hand, and again you do not find the factory girl associating with the girls who hawk their goods in the streets. For all our references to 1913 and the lockout, we sometimes forget that William Martin Murphy's objection was not to trade unionism per se, but to the organisation of the so-called unskilled. Congregate around Liberty Hall. When these citizens of Dublin get properly charged with drink, the rioting commences. Into Dublin streets they have poured all the foul reserves of the slums, human beings whom life in the most darksome depths of a great city is deprived of most of the characteristics of civilization. In the majority of instances, they are beings whose career is generally a prolonged debauch, seldom broken by the call of labour. They are essentially birds of night, and foul birds at that. And this language is about more than a trade union dispute. It's language about a particular section of the Dublin working class who are despised. And it has echoes actually in the descriptions of another group of people in Ireland during the revolutionary period. What Republicans often referred to as the rabble, the roughs, the mob, tinkers, the corner boys, and so on. The inhabitants of the lanes and the other districts and country towns, who invariably clashed physically with Republicans throughout the war years and during the 1918 elections, and indeed beyond. Now, Republicans tended to blame these conflicts on those with relatives in the British Army, particularly women, the so-called separation women. But of course, we have no account from separation women or their daughters themselves. People wrote about them, but they didn't write about themselves. And it's quite clear to me that class prejudice colours the Republican presentation of them, because Republicans in general did not come from the same class as these people. They're often described as supporters of either the Home Rule Party or even as Unionists. And in 1922, their menfolk are seamlessly presented as the new recruits to the Free State Army. But an interesting question is, what happens to all these people after independence? In May 1934, the Fine Gael TD Paddy Belton addressed a party rally at Dunshaughlin, County Meath, with blue shirts very much in evidence. And he asked rhetorically, who are the supporters of De Valera? They were, he claimed, the old women who in 1918 were shouting up the Union Jack when they were getting the separation allowance. It was these who were following De Valera in every town and village. The separation allowance women are their descendants. And if De Valera could not get much better than him, then the poor man's cause was lost. Laughter and cheers. Now, I think it's significant in some way that Belton is using this accusation, but he had a point, because De Valera's Fianna Fáil had succeeded in winning broad support amongst the rural and urban poor. And this was clearly less to do with retrospective endorsement of document number 2, and more to do with Fianna Fáil's social and economic policies. But can we transfer this class analysis back to the Civil War, back to 1922? Because then again, the situation was quite different. In the run-up to the Civil War, the Communist Party's newspaper, the Workers' Republic, had a headline, May 1922, which hasn't aged that well, I don't think, Civil War Necessary. But nevertheless, the paper also contained perceptive analysis of the prevailing mood, noting in July 1922, as the Civil War began, that a big percentage of the Irish are apathetic to the struggle. This is particularly true of the landless peasants and the workers in the towns, in the cities and big towns. And certainly the Republican movement could be split along class as well as political lines. In early 1922, during a farm labourers' dispute in South Wexford, the decision of the local IRA leadership to arrest strikers at the request of the Farmers' Union led to 170 of their volunteers, all labourers themselves, out of a total strength of about 300, to refuse to parade in protest. But to assume a clear pro or anti-treaty position from these men would be incorrect. At the same time, the local secretary of the Irish Transport Union, the union to which these labourers belonged, wrote to Jim Ryan TD, an anti-treatyite, to tell him that the Transport Union branch had decided, as organised workers, to call upon him, representing Wexford and Ondall, to vote for the Anglo-Irish Treaty. They said, "We may state that we have not been stampeded by press reports or speeches of outside individuals, but we believe that with control of education and finance, the social conditions can be so improved that ultimately the goal for which our union aims and for which James Connolly died will become an accomplished fact, namely a workers' republic. We are of the opinion that the present treaty is a step in that direction." Now, I'm not claiming any great insights to tell you that. It obviously means that working class opinion on the national question was very complex and very diverse and often very divided. While the new Free State administration certainly pursued naked class war politics in its treatment of postal workers and its use of the Special Infantry Corps against farm labourers in the southeast, the experiences of some workers with the anti-treaty forces didn't suggest that natural sympathy would be coming from that end either. Dan Breen, for one, wrote contemptuously about what he called the red flag regime that had been established across Tipperary, with workers, as he said, who had been denouncing impartially the militarism of both Free Staters and Republicans, now setting up little Soviets of their own. When the farmers refused to deliver the usual supplies of milk to the creameries after the new regime had been set up, the workers in Carrick, Clonmel and Tipperary attempted by intimidation to compel them to do so. As a result, detachments of the IRA had to fire several volleys over the heads of the raging mobs before order could be restored. Fellow anti-treatyite Michael Davern remembered ordering his men to fire shots again over strikers' heads at Black Bridge, the workers then being forced out of occupation at gunpoint, the creamery reopened and the red flag burnt by his men. All of this suggests, of course, that many workers would not have assumed that either section of the Republican movement or either side of the treaty split were naturally on their side. And again, I don't claim any special insight in pointing this out, except today that a century on, people still tend to assume that you can explain the treaty split simply by reference to the working class on one side and the bosses on the other. And I think when we just talk about the idea of a workers' republic, in the 1930s, the split from the IRA, the Republican Congress, itself split over whether or not to use that term. In 1936, as I mentioned, the Labour Party briefly adopted it as a name and then dropped it due to a ferocious clerical backlash. But I think the question of class and politics and the national question is apparent again when we jump forward 50 years. There have been many other anniversaries over the last decade, quite apart from those of the revolutionary era, and some of them have obviously been less marked than others. When reflecting on Ireland during the 1960s, Todd Andrews again complained that the unofficial strike, supported, as it so often seems, by a near mystical respect to the picket line, is an evil in the body politic. In 1968, reporting on the IRA's burning of buses carrying strikebreakers during the EI dispute at Shannon, the Washington Post no less noted how the multinational had failed to conform to practices in this most unionised country in Western Europe. By 1970, there were 387,000 trade union members in the Republic, around 52% of the workforce, a percentage which would rise to over 60% by that decade's end. But the feature of industrial relations noted by Andrews caused intense unease to employers, politicians, and to the unions themselves. As a delegate from the Workers' Union of Ireland told the 1970 IPTU conference, the problem concerning pickets is not that members would know which picket to pass and which picket not to pass. The problem is that members will not pass any picket, irrespective of whether it is official or otherwise. The union's leader, Dennis Larkin, again somewhat ironically, as his father's tradition of syndicalism was one of the reasons really why this remained an issue, argued, you don't have the same system in the north as you have here. You don't have the same system in Britain with all their thousands of militant trade unionists. You don't have a situation that as soon as a single individual decides that he's going to have a strike, takes a piece of stick and puts a paper on it and walks in front of an industry, everybody stops. That doesn't happen in Britain, it doesn't happen on the continent, it doesn't happen in the north of Ireland. It happens here because we have a particular commitment to being militant in this regard. And this was widely discussed and recognised at the time, but I think it's vanished to some extent, both from popular consciousness and even from the consciousness of the labour movement as well. I think we can safely say that what they identified as a problem has been solved. The term scab today carries far less social weight than 50 years ago. But as I say, this militancy has in many ways vanished from our popular consciousness, as has the much higher profile trade unions and their leaders had in the national discourse in that period. And certainly in the 1970s, I think people like Matt Merrigan and Michael Mullen were far more central to everyday discussion of Irish life than any trade union leader today. Now, of course, there were problems with this militancy. The maintenance strike of 1969 might not be remembered as fondly by manual workers as it could be by electricians or fitters. And recession, mass unemployment, deindustrialisation, and in the part of Dublin most associated historically with the lockout, the heroin epidemic of the 1980s, all conspired to weaken and change the nature of the working class and ultimately of the labour movement too. And obviously there's also another factor, the national question itself, which returned very dramatically in the late 1960s. And how people viewed that influence on labour and how obviously organised labour viewed that, I think, is significant too. On the 22nd of January 1980, an estimated 700,000 people participated in trade union marches across the state, what the Irish Times called the biggest demonstration of organised labour in the history of the Irish state. Indeed, these marches are commemorated just inside the other doorway downstairs. But later that year, the editor of the Irish Press, Tim Pat Coogan, lamented that more people marched to get the PAYE system changed in a few days than the North brought onto the streets in 10 years. Indeed, the previous year, a columnist in the Andersonstown News from Belfast had written about the tax marches that apparently Southerners have discovered a cause worth marching for, a cause in which justice coincides with self-interest. At the end of the day, it's money they're marching for and not idealism. The marchers could have marched for many better issues, but they chose to march for money. Their manifest priorities tell us something about the 26th state and its ethos, 26th county state and its ethos. Now, that was a view shaped by a particular Northern nationalist sense of betrayal, but it ignored, of course, the very significant mobilisations in solidarity with Northern nationalists among trade unionists and others, in particular between 1968 and 1972, notably the strikes and walkouts following Bloody Sunday, which by their nature were almost universally unofficial. And I think the nature of protest about the North is not unrelated to the general militancy that many workers felt in that period. But after 1969, the national conversation would very much often revolve around the North, and in many ways, of course, still does. The national question, I believe, is still our most intense culture war issues. We may import others, but nothing divides people as viscerally as any discussion about the North or nationalism or republicanism. The impact that the Northern conflict had on trade unions and the working class more generally, North and South, obviously in a far more brutal way in general in the North, but also south of the border, remains relatively underexplored. You don't have to agree with the assessment of Tony Gregory that prior to 1969, in his view in Dublin, there was a huge radicalism among young people, and probably all of that was diverted or destroyed by the North. The North blew up and it dissipated, to note that something indeed did change after the Troubles began. Now, Gregory himself was a member of the Republican movement, and there were many on the left who hoped that a workers' republic might emerge somehow by the radicalisation of Southern workers around the issue of the North. But the fact that many Irish trade unions organised both North and South or had their headquarters in Britain further complicated this issue. The bitter disputes around issues such as the H-Block reflected within the trade unions reflected what one activist referred to as the split in working class consciousness between the social and national questions, or even the lack of any interest in the national question. And I think this is something that's both genuine and deeply rooted, and is often not understood by critics, that actually many Southern workers, for pretty good reasons, never felt that the North directly concerned them. Next year, we will have the 50th anniversary of a display of working class power that will serve to remind us of a division that remains acute and key to any future discussion about the politics of this island. And that's the 1974 Ulster Workers' Council strike, which again will be interesting to see how it's remembered and how it's discussed. To conclude, I would say that in general terms, when you talk about republicanism and socialism, it's quite clear from even how we commemorate things that what might be broadly called the Irish establishment is a lot more fearful of republicanism than it is of organised labour. 2013, there was very little angst, expressed about whether all our commemoration of the lockout would lead to waves of unofficial strikes or a growth in trade union membership. In fact, nobody thought that it might. Yet by 2016, any discussion of the Easter Rising, and particularly of the events thereafter, is seen by some people as immediately giving fuel to a rebirth of some form of militant republicanism. Indeed, if you look at the way that hostile commentators talk about Sinn Féin's support today, it's very often couched in terms that are laden with class prejudice. A few years ago, the Sunday Independent columnist John Drennan contended that Sinn Féin voters favoured a diet of chips, Dutch Gold and batter burgers. Gerard Howland, recently writing in the Irish Times about the emergence of racism and far-right politics, lamented that up until recently, in his view, Sinn Féin had managed to keep the feral population of the inner cities under control. So it's quite clear, I think, that when republicanism is discussed, there's an assumption that modern Republicans come from a certain section of society. My contention, of course, is that a century ago that was not necessarily the case. Whether it matters or not to this discussion now, I think is obviously open to question. Republicanism a century ago could have a very benign attitude towards organised labour, but it was also ruthlessly pragmatic. It was friendly to labour, even on occasion adopting its slogans, but labour would always come second, I think. And I think the lesson for the future is that labour has to be aware that no matter what happens in terms of our day-to-day politics, that it doesn't come second. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Brian. As he said, these are some of the questions that give rise to the most intense debate in our culture. And we have, a few minutes to take questions or comments. And what I might do is take 3 questions, and we'll try and get to questions rather than comments maybe on this. And we'll see if we get time for a second round. There is a roving mic. There's Donal has a roving mic there. So would somebody like to kick off with a brief comment followed by a question? And please give your name when asking.
Thanks. John O'Brien from the Retired Teachers Association. Brian, excellent talk. Thank you very, very much for that. One small little question, and you touched on it very briefly there towards the end, and it occurs to me that the fact that there were a significant number of unions active in both the Republic and the North who were based in Britain, I'm just curious as to if you discovered any kind of relationship between that fact and a change in discourse or an influence of discourse in the couple of issues that you were talking about.
Thank you very much. Is there another hand? Thank you.
Yeah. Pat Bulger, I'm a trustee of the society, and most people know I'm a Republican. So I think that class interest and national sovereignty are natural partners in any just solution. But just want to get an opinion of the speaker. Post-Brexit, with the constitutional debate re-arising, albeit in a fairly mellow way most of the time, is there an opportunity for the trade union movement around potential constitutional change to reposition itself as the opinion leader on social and economic justice?
Okay, and we'll take one more in this round.
Yes, the question I would like to, John Martin, like to ask. Yes, we have to know our own history. We have to know the working class and trade union movement history, and I use the other words, the history of social justice throughout society. I think that is the should be the banner. Social justice is the way forward. But we have to know as much about ourselves as we do about the enemy. No good general will go onto a battlefield until he knows what he is actually facing and who is doing what to who. No, we don't have an opportunity at the moment, and what we're dealing with, worldwide, to actually build or rebuild a trade union movement that will actually change Irish society. But what the trade union movement and the labour movement and the social justice movement will have to do is we will all have to come together as one movement and work as one movement, not only in Ireland, in Europe and worldwide. I don't think the labour movement, trade union movement are in a position at the moment or have the time to recreate an army that can take down our enemy.
Okay, thank you, John. Brian, I might ask you to.
Yeah, good questions, and again, I'll take the question about the position of the unions. I mean, in the 1970s, when the Northern crisis re-emerged, you have unions like the Irish Transport and General Workers Union and the INTO, who organised north and south of the border, and whose membership in the north tended to be Catholics or tended to be from nationalist backgrounds. And one impact the conflict has is that members of those unions are killed, and you also have, at various stages, the politics of the union leaderships reflected in what the unions tried to do, and there's a whole story there, which again, I've written about, but other people will be familiar about the huge amount of money raised by the trade union movement in 1969 and again in 1971, and about the aid given to refugees and about various efforts to aid after internment. For example, again, Dublin Trades Council is involved in setting up an internees dependence fund, and thousands of workers across the country give money to that. But there's no clear, I think the British-based unions, depending on their leaderships really, took varying positions, which are not always straightforward. So I suppose I'll give you an example. After Bloody Sunday, there was an effort on behalf of some nationalists to try and drive British-based unions out of the Republic of Ireland, to ask workers to leave the transport, the ATGW, for example, and join an Irish-based union. And some elements within the Irish Transport Union tried to encourage that. And basically that conflict you'd had for almost a century between the British-based unions and their Irish counterparts was intensified to some extent. But that didn't really work. And one of the reasons it didn't really work with the ATGW was that Matt Merrigan, who was its leader, was a socialist Republican and took a very strong stance on the issue of the North. Now, the fact was that in the North, the ATG's membership majority was probably Protestant, but nevertheless, he still took a very strong line, didn't support the IRA, but nevertheless opposed government clampdowns on Republicans in the South and so on. So I think it is very complicated. In Waterford, for example, the Waterford Glass Factory, which had been organised by the ATGW, took very active line on campaigns around prisoners' rights and so on, even though they were a British-based union. Now, other British-based unions were slightly different, and you do see tensions arising over, in Galway, for example, members of the National Graphical Association refused to print an advert for a Sinn Féin rally, they said, as a protest against the ongoing violence in the North. And then at local level, you see all kinds of diverse ideas and differences. But I think it is significant that the unions organised North and South, and that they were a place, and I know Emmett O'Connor has an essay on this, I think, in a new book about the North, in terms of what actually happened to the unions and how they tried to hold the line in many cases in terms of opposing sectarianism and so on, is a very important story to tell. Even though, again, there will be differences about what people thought they should have done, nevertheless, what they did try to do was very, very significant. And they were one of the few places where Catholic and Protestant and people of other opinions could actually be members of the same bodies and occasionally come together in their common interests. I think the question of United Ireland and the national question as beyond a doubt re-emerged. And as you say, the debate has been fairly mellow. Well, I don't know if it's been that mellow really, because it, as I say, the most visceral debates we have tend to be about this idea, and the very fact that a Fine Gael Taoiseach talks about a United Ireland in his lifetime is symbolic of a particular shift. Now, if that is to be a reality, then I think the Labour movement has to play a central role in that, and they in some ways are uniquely placed to do so. But I'm not going to stand here and tell them what to do, because I think there are a whole range of other issues and problems which the Labour movement will have to grapple with and is trying to grapple with, which are also potentially hugely dangerous and demoralising. And that revolves around the issue of class and the working class more generally. There's a very large section of the Irish working class who are not members of trade unions and never likely to be. There's a section of our younger working class who are lost to organised crime from a pretty young age. And there are working class communities where, for the first time in my lifetime, the organised far right are working extremely hard to get a foothold. And there's some crossover with crime there as well. And all these are huge issues that the Labour movement can play a positive role in. But nevertheless, the Labour movement itself has to be aware of those and organised enough to do that. I think we do need to have a discussion, that the discussion about a United Ireland, for example, can't be just about what people said 40 years ago or 30 years ago, or about what people divided over on those issues. The rehearsal of age-old debates won't work for the future. People can be clear and honest about what they thought, but nevertheless see that there's a new generation now who aren't even aware of those arguments and who are looking at things very differently. But certainly I think it's something that we have to be very conscious of when we talk about an Irish Labour movement and what role it might play in a future society.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Brian. We are right up against the time now for the next session. So just would like you to show your appreciation for Brian's superb paper. Thank you very much.